Hello, I've come to the Wieland Monument on Wielandplatz because I want to ask whether this is a piece of art. I don't mean that in an evaluative sense. I'm not asking about the quality of the sculpture. My question pertains to the criteria for art. Is a memorial ever a piece of art? Or alternatively, is it always a piece of art by definition?
The monument shows a poet grasping his work Oberon. The bronze statue was created by Hans Gasser and unveiled in 1857, at the same time as the monument to Goethe and Schiller in the Theaterplatz. And it's set right outside a very nice coffee shop.
There's often much controversy about whether certain things can be considered art or not. Can paintings created by way of throwing paint at a canvas or into a river really be art? Can a melted audio CD be a piece of music?
Sometimes the questions can become tiresome, but if it's possible to say the necessary essence of water is H2O, its chemical compound, whereby anything that's not H2O cannot be water, and it's possible to say the necessary essence of life on our planet is defined by the DNA molecule, then why should the essence of art be so elusive? The problem is derived from the fact that art and music are not perceived in terms of necessity at all. The very subjective status of all human convention makes these things idiosyncratic and subject to whim.
Incidentally, Goethe and Schelling extended this same principle to science. Even before the advent of chemistry, they were enthusiastic about the prospect of identifying necessary essence or primal phenomena in the seemingly objective world of nature. And yet still they believed there were limits to scientific study when it came to the Urpflanze, the symbolic plant. After all, subjectivity and natural law were equivalent to one another.
Actually, Weimar identity thesis has no difficulties at all in defining the necessary essence of art as analogous to the necessary essence of nature, although the details of what this actually means are not altogether clear. It doesn't help determine what the essence of art is. Consequently, ever since the classical Weimar era, there have been many attempts to add detail, and in particular to address the matter of art essentialism objectively. Cluster theorists, such as the young John Searle, suggested that something might be considered art if it satisfies a sufficient number of criteria to be called art. If it checks, for instance, 3 out of 5 boxes, it passes. Actually, I could say this represents an anti-essentialist standpoint, as none of these criteria alone would necessarily determine the essence of art. Furthermore, the criteria themselves are likely to be very general. Stephen Davies pointed out that the problem with this claim is that everything resembles every other thing, so the invocation of resemblances cannot explain the unity and integrity of any concept.
There have also been other creative approaches to defining the essence of art. Functionalists argue that the essence of a work of art lies in its ability to achieve the purpose intended for that art. In other words, if I intend an object to be a piece of art, if I intend a sculpture to be a work of art, and it matches my intentions, then it's a work of art. Simple.
However, again, this approach doesn't take things very far at all. It situates the essence of art in purpose or function, yet it doesn't identify what that function or purpose might be, other than the intent to create art, which takes us back to an undefined art and becomes a circular argument.
This is a piece of music because I intend it to be a piece of music, which is a piece of music because I intend it to be a piece of music, and so forth. Or alternatively, if I rate my piece of music by virtue of the extent to which my artistic insight makes it pleasurable to listen to, then the characteristics of both artistic insight and pleasure require justification by criteria, and then those criteria require their own criteria, and so forth.
A further derivative of this approach can be seen in the popular theory of proceduralism. This argues that essence is instrumental. In the case of art, it lies in the process used to create the artwork. By process, I don't mean the types of paint or pencil or computer software used. I mean the mental process. The act of conceiving artwork is a mental process, an intentional stance, and accordingly, definitions are inevitably going to be instrumental, varied according to context. They're descriptive and non-evaluative, not necessary conditions, as is the case for physical materials, even if this doesn't bode well for the cottage industry of music and art prizes that's developed in relative abundance.
An instrumental approach like this also avoids the question of whether the aesthetic experience in art is derived from that art or vice versa. Does the subject create the art and thus perceive the beauty, or perceive beauty and thus create the art? It provides no ontological commitment that might reveal necessary essence.
Many 18th century figures, including Weimar classicists, characterised the faculty of aesthetics in terms of an internal sense. It was not to be considered the equivalent of the direct senses like sight and hearing, because it depended on mental faculties beyond the direct sense. Yet still it was experienced as immediate rather than a result of reason or any other rational states of mind. Indeed, there was a great reluctance to associate beauty with reason. Referring to the application of aesthetics to art convention, James Shelley argued that theory of taste emerged, in part, as a corrective to the rise of rationalism, particularly as applied to beauty, and to the rise of egoism, particularly as applied to virtue. Kant took up the theme in great earnest and added an epistemological perspective to matters. He argued that the discernment of beauty is immediate and prior to reason, and prior to ethical judgment too. However, he also recognised this approach breaks down when applied to complex art, such as literary works or Sturm und Drang symphonies, which require rationalisations and judgments for their full comprehension and appreciation. But otherwise, aesthetic principles or judgments are to be seen as embodying the notions of qualitative experience, but not of attitudes and values, and not of empirical facts. Here's an example of what this might mean. The idea that the sunset is beautiful includes an aesthetic judgment about the sunset by way of the predicate is beautiful. Similarly, if I say Beethoven's Ninth Symphony is sublime, then I'm making an aesthetic judgment about this symphony, which has got nothing to do with its instrumentation or pictures, at least not directly. If I say this music, or any particular music, is awful and makes me feel sick, then the nature of the displeasure is not only a physiological one, but also an aesthetic one.
I can describe what I see when the sun sets. I see the horizon and the sun going down behind it, and I can describe these things in nomenologically necessary terms by way of the electromagnetic radiation that comprises light, and the orbit of the Earth, and my geometric relation to the two. But how do I describe the subjective experience of beauty or sublimity objectively?
A doctor might be able to tell me which nerves are the cause of the pain, yet not be able to say anything at all about the actual feel of the pain. Indeed, science and the entire plethora of human knowledge is unable to describe in ontological terms the qualitative experience of a sunset being beautiful or of a symphony being sublime. It cannot describe anything subjective objectively, all of which makes describing my opera in a meaningful way rather tricky. But that's the purpose of this inquiry after all. If Kant and Hume avoided the issue by discussing aesthetics almost exclusively in terms of nature, whereby art is merely derivative of the faculty of aesthetics as it's applied to natural phenomena, 19th century thinkers after Hegel mostly turned to using art as an instrumental form of self-enhancement, which in turn drove the notion of art and aesthetic experience as existing as a single whole, each dependent on the other, a mirror of the equivalences outlined by the Weimar identity thesis. Aesthetic attitudes were established in the practice of art, and vice versa. It was in this way that art became identified with the understanding of meaning and purpose in nature. In recent decades, the analytic tradition of philosophy has tried to untangle these ideas. Frank Sibley wanted to step outside the notions of equivalencies and instrumentalism and focus instead on logical priorities. Engaging with the same dilemmas considered by Kant and Hume and the Weimar classicists, he asked whether aesthetics is logically prior to or logically derived from art. Can there be art without aesthetics, or vice versa? Sibley was able to demonstrate in favour of aesthetic experience taking precedence. Echoing the sentiments of the 18th century, he said, "The concept of art is logically secondary or dependent on the concept of the aesthetic. It is inconceivable there could be no aesthetic awareness of natural phenomena unless art existed."
In this episode, I want to take this further and explore the thesis that aesthetics itself represents the necessary essence of art. Wieland is art to the extent he enables the qualitative experience of aesthetic perception.
In support of this position, I'll begin by proposing that the essence of art must necessarily be situated in the locus of subjective mind. All but a solipsist would agree that a tree can exist without there being a mind to perceive it as a tree, but the same is not true of art. It's not possible to have art without a mind to perceive it as art. The birds in the trees are not going to perceive Wieland as art, at least I don't think they are. Accordingly, next I'll propose that the locus of subjective mind must possess the faculty of aesthetic experience to identify the qualitative nature of art. This position implies that the identification of art merely by way of social convention is merely an artificial substitute. Taking these two proposals together, it would thereafter be possible to argue that the essence of art depends necessarily upon the qualitative experience of aesthetics. I think it's an argument that both Schiller and Hegel would have had sympathy with. But actually, the bulk of art and music tradition rejects this position. Following on from Sibley, George Dickey also looked at the essence of art, and in particular at the very role of affective content in art. He pointed out that aesthetic experience can cover the full range of any criterion norms that might be suggested, from feelings that are coherent to those that are incoherent, to situations where there are no feelings at all, and from expectations that are satisfied to those that are dissatisfied, and to situations where there are no expectations at all. Echoing Davies' point, Dickey wrote, "The experiences which derive from intercourse with aesthetic objects do not have any affective features which are peculiarly characteristic and which distinguish them from other experiences." He argued that if art depends upon aesthetics, then it can be seen to depend on anything and everything, which is not very helpful in defining criteria for essence at all.
To overcome this problem, I want to focus on the extent to which music depends upon aesthetics, not only in terms of subjective taste, with people in one subculture preferring one mode of expression and people in another subculture preferring another mode, but in terms of whether this is a necessary dependence. If it is, this would imply that music cannot exist without aesthetics.
But as I've said, there are many who refute this position. For instance, formalists argue that the essence of music lies not in aesthetic or qualitative matters at all, but in the quantitative musical relationships that exist in any particular piece of music. The pitches C and D are to be considered as existing as a tone apart, according to the convention of tempered pitch. A sustained C minim, or half note, sounded simultaneously with two crotchets, or quarter notes, rising from a D to an F sharp, is to be considered as a sustained C minim sounded simultaneously with two crotchets rising from a D to an F sharp. The rhythm of the music, including the harmonic rhythm and the structural rhythm, is to be derived from the notes in an entirely contextual manner, in a purely musical manner.
The formalist tradition has been a popular one in music history. The Leipzig conservatives, who opposed Liszt and the radical modern style of the new German school, including Mendelssohn and the Schumanns as well as the young Brahms, arguing for romanticism without the idealism, posited that music can never represent anything other than itself. Actually, Brahms visited Weimar in 1853 and no doubt asked while he was here, "What's all of this talk about the mind anyhow? It's the external form that matters."
Thereafter, Stravinsky showed his preference for understanding music formalistically when he wrote, "The poetics of the classical philosophers did not consist of lyrical dissertations about the essence of beauty. For them, the single word techne was applied to the knowledge and study of the certain and inevitable rules of the craft. This is why Aristotle's Poetics constantly suggests ideas regarding personal work arrangements of materials and structure. Suffice it to say that we shall not use music as a pretext for pleasant fancies." Thereafter, the Soviet Union demanded a formalist approach of its composers. No expressions of non-musical content were allowed, and especially not representations of the state's demand for an absence of non-musical content. In all of these cases, formalism held that music meaning is derived from musical matters alone, and not extra musical matters. In many cases it was, and still is, a position designed to demonstrate contempt for the trivialities of metaphorical cliché, which I illustrated before. But it's also associated with disdain for the superficial equivalences intended by cognitive language for musical language. It's another refutation of the Weimar identity thesis, based on an uncompromising positivist stance, advocating the self-sufficiency of music as a correspondent to nature, and rejecting the supernatural of extra-musical content as a correspondent to religion.
It's a case of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. It mistakenly takes extra-musical content, and language in particular, to be the dirty water. Yet in rejecting a role for cognitive language and metaphorical illusion in general, it rejects its very essence, the qualitative aspects of aesthetic experience.
But actually, without experience, language means nothing. If I have an experience of hearing an oboe play an A, and I describe what I hear as the oboe is playing an A, the experience itself is not represented by the propositional language, and neither does the language undermine the quality of the actual experience. The feel of the timbre and of the particular pitch and the shape of the waveform is something completely different to the words used to describe such things. Indeed, as these 18th century thinkers recognised, the experience is an immediate phenomena that the subject adds to using the realm of cognitive language.
If I want to communicate my experience of anything qualitative, I must use linguistic content. This is merely a pragmatic matter of communication. I'll have to use extra musical language given there's no musical word that describes the qualitative sound of a violin. I'll have to join the conventions of characterizing music as light and delicate or heavy and brooding, all of which are extra musical words describing the aesthetics of music experience, but which do not affect at all matters of ontology.
Sibley said, all music must be describable in aptly figurative language. Critics, program writers and analysts constantly employ quality, process and scenario descriptions. Conductors rehearsing orchestras often do likewise. Composers not only mark their work légèrement, maestoso, martellato, etc., but may offer scenario-like programs or titles. Communication of aesthetic judgment relies upon the assumption that others have had similar experiences and are therefore able to understand language descriptions. Qualitative features are not as straightforward to describe as those pertaining to formal elements, to non-aesthetic elements. Descriptions of a C major chord, or a plagal cadence, or a 12-tone row, or a diminuendo are literal terms that can be pointed to empirically, yet literal terms do not encompass the actual experience of listening to music. I cannot say the meaning of a Mozart symphony lies exclusively in its use of sonata form, or its choice of keys or use of modulation. Musical meaning is defined by aesthetic elements too. Even the sound of the violin or of the orchestra is a part of the meaning of these pieces, yet these are not literal entities, they're qualitative. Indeed, the use of words cannot and does not act as a replacement of experience, which is qualitative. Frank Sibley said, there are no terms in which we hear or understand music. Our hearing, grasping or understanding of it is therefore not in musical or extra-musical terms. The ethnographic or pluralist account, which seems common today, has largely displaced the prevalence of formalist accounts. However, while it's placed a lot of attention on defining how music expression is contingent and culture-bound, the necessary nature of qualitative experience, in contrast, has not received much attention at all. This despite the fact that music without aesthetics would not be art. My thesis here is that it would not even be music. It would be akin to the bird's perspective on Wieland.
But when I look at the Wieland Memorial and ask whether it should be considered art or not, the answer lies necessarily in the nature of my aesthetic response to it. If I perceive it aesthetically, then it's necessarily art. And given I can perceive anything aesthetically, whether natural or human fashioned, anything can be art. All of which reminds me that any answer I might come up with is dependent upon something far broader. Something that I suspect Wieland might have discussed with his contemporaries in this very square. What is the nature of thought such that it can ask this question in the first place? I'll finish with another brief section from the music that started this episode. A piece for mezzo-soprano, flute, piano and percussion, Haro no Haiku, sung by Chia Kitamura. Thanks for listening.